How did you get into the military? Did you come from a military family?
Uh, yeah, only in from World War Two. So by the time I came along, uh, the military side of it was a distant history. My grandparents fought in World War One, my parents in World War Two, but by the time I came along, Dad was a school teacher, Mum was a homemaker. But it wasn't so much that I wanted to be in the military, but I wanted to be a pilot. So that was the only economic way of doing it. So was to go into the military. So
Okay. Did you grow up
um,
with any brothers or sisters?
yeah, I've got a younger brother and two younger sisters, none of whom went along my path. Um, we had national service here. My brother was a bit, he was eligible for that, but that didn't come up either, like conscription. So I was the sole next generation military. Um, I didn't recognise, as one does at the time, didn't realise because my mother had lost several good friends in World War Two. Her brother, my uncle, had been in Bomber Command in World War Two. He lost you know, numbers of people. So they were pretty worried about me going into the military. But anyway, I did.
You said it was a love of aviation that
Yeah,
that
yeah.
drew you. So where did that come from?
Um, I have no idea really. But from a very young age, I'd managed to get a couple of flights with a friend who was a farmer and also a flying instructor, civil flying instructor, and he would take me out occasionally, and we'd go and do some aerobatics or something. And yeah, I was hooked by my early teens. So it was it was inevitable that that's what I wanted to be. I just was fortunate that I was able to manage it. It could have gone wrong at any stage, medically or whatever. But anyway, I got there, and so at, as soon as I turned 18, I applied to join the Air Force as a pilot, um, and was accepted. And um, 16 months later, I was churned out at the other end as a pilot and a pilot officer, which is equivalent to a second lieutenant, bottom of the rank. Other people on my pilot's course were sent to things like fighters and bombers and transports and whatever, but there were 8 of us who were sent to helicopters, and from there, inevitably, you would go to Vietnam once you'd been converted and got some experience. And
So for the first 16 months, you trained on fixed wing aircraft,
fixed wing, yep.
and
Yeah,
then
the first, yep.
when you went from there to helicopter pilot school, was that something you wanted to do? Was it voluntary, or were you assigned that?
You were assigned it, but you had your preferences. So yeah, so I'd said, oh, I want to be a fighter pilot, I want to be a bomber pilot. If I can't be those, I'll be a helicopter pilot. So very few people went to fighters or bombers to fast jets. Although we did train on jets our second half of our course, so we were all qualified on jet trainers. But yeah, so helicopters was sort of considered desirable, and so there I went.
What do you
And
remember about that training?
yeah, it was uh, what was mainly memorable about it. We got there in January of 1969. Started our training in Canberra, and within a couple of weeks, there'd been a fatal accident, lost two pilots, and then a few weeks after that, 2 of the pilots on my course, who I'd been course mates through, for the last 18 months, were killed in a second accident. So everything ground to a halt while they figured out. Well, in fact, they never really figured out what went wrong in these 2 cases. So our training was a bit protracted. So it took nearly 6 months, all of which was conducted on Hueys, Bravo model Hueys, some of which had actually been in Vietnam previously and been sent home to use as trainers. So about 6 months of training with instructors and doing just the learning how not to disappear across the aerodrome while trying to hover or whatever. And then we went off to do support exercises with the Army, including a few weeks in New Guinea, where we worked with the Special Air Services, our Special Forces people, training for them and ourselves in jungle warfare. And they, in fact, were the same Special Forces outfit that was in Vietnam when I was there. So we had a pretty good rapport. So it took from start of training to arriving in Vietnam was about 15 months.
What month and year was it that you arrived in Vietnam?
I arrived there in April 1970. Now, by then we were all concerned that, oh, geez, maybe the war will be over by the time we get there, but it wasn't. It was still, from our perspective, ticking along more or less as it had for the last couple of years, in the last 3 or 4 years. Right at the end of my tour, 12 months later, things did start to wind down. Australia removed 1 battalion from its task force, and it was by the end of 1971, our squadron had been withdrawn, and basically the frontline involvement had come to an end. There was still some training going on, but for the 12 months I was there, it was as it had been for the last several years.
And when you were a young guy dreaming of being a pilot,
yeah,
you probably even picture yourself flying helicopters in
Vietnam. No, well, in fact, it was in March of '66. The government announced that these 8 helicopters from the Air Force were going to be sent to Vietnam, and while that was sort of a passing interest to me, it didn't really, because I didn't join the Air Force for another 12 months. But it never really occurred to me. Once you were in the Air Force, though, it's one of these things where you think, well, if that's what you're trained to do, then you do think, as a volunteer, as someone who's not, if that's what I'm trained to do, then I should really go and do this for real, if you have the opportunity. And I do know one of my friends in particular who was sent to fighters, and he did amazing things as a fighter pilot. But a few years ago, he said he was in awe of guys who actually went to Vietnam, even on the transport pilots, in that he never actually got to do what he was trained to do. It was all just train. And so we actually got to do the real thing. And
what do you remember about arriving in Vietnam? What were your first impressions of the country?
Quite vividly, actually. Yeah, quite vividly, actually. We arrived in our case, we flew up from Sydney in a charter 707, arrived in Saigon. It was hot, noisy, unpleasant at Tan Son Nhut, and eventually the system got us on an aeroplane and flew. There's two pilots posted at the same time, flew us down to Vung Tau, where we were based, and it was dark by then. Had no idea where we were. We were put in the back of this 5-ton truck with our luggage, such as it was, and driven up to the Air Force living quarters, where we were met by our CO, and who we knew. Everyone knew each other because we'd all been through the same system in Canberra under training. So it was almost like a bit of a reunion of sorts. Some of these guys were just about to go home. They'd done their 12 months, but you'd met them before and you knew them. And I think that was one of the secrets to the success of our operation, was the real camaraderie. Everyone was long-term, if not friends and acquaintances, pretty close, a pretty tight-knit little, I hate the word tight-knit, but it was a pretty well coordinated outfit. Arrived there. If you've got to be in Vietnam, Vung Tau was the place to be. It's southeast of Saigon on the coast. It was basically a tourist resort during French colonial days. It is now a tourist resort again. There's a lovely beach on the eastern side of this peninsula. The aerodrome where we were based, I was there a few years ago. It's still in use, flying helicopters going out to oil rigs. But at the time, we had ourselves there another Australian Air Force transport squadron flying C-7 Caribous, American Caribous, USAF Caribous, USAF Ford air controllers. It was a busy place. Our living conditions in the Air Force were pretty damn good. I mean, I had a individual little, small room in a 2-story wooden building, whereas our army guys lived under canvas the whole time they were there. So we did pretty well, and we basically commuted every day to the task force base, the Army task force base at Nui Dat, about 30 kilometres north of where we were. Did our operations out of there and came home at night to warm bed and cold beer. It was pretty damn good in retrospect. Occasionally it did go wrong, but could have been a lot worse. So having arrived there, I was there about, well, in fact, exactly 2 days, getting issued with your safety equipment, your firearms, your chicken plate, your flak vest, all that sort of stuff, new helmets. And 2 days later, I did my first sortie, just to familiarise with the area. The helicopter wasn't a problem. By now they were hotel model Iroquois, but basically the same. And it was just a matter of getting used to the environment, getting used to how it could be very busy with working 3 different radio sets for the co-pilot and maintaining situational awareness, that sort of thing. Took you a couple of days, but we were pretty familiar with how the operation went. So, yeah. And in fact, I had a look the other day, it was only a week later that I did my first, as a co-pilot, did my first Special Forces infiltration, which went bad as soon as we dropped off the patrol. Literally,
do you remember where you dropped them off?
Yeah, it was east of Nui Dat in our AO, probably about 20 k's east of what is now the city of Berea in Vietnam, in a jungle, just a hole in the jungle. The guys would do a survey from maps and from a high over flight and think, well, that's a good place to start our patrol. And then we'd brief extensively, and it'd be the insert aircraft would be directed from afar by the flight leader. So we'd go in very low level for about 20 kilometres on the trees, and then a zigzag path, and turn up alongside the pad, do a quick 180-degree turn, drop off the half a dozen guys in the back, which took all of probably less than 10 seconds. So they really wanted to get out and get away from the helicopter. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. But as soon as we lifted off, we actually heard a gunshot, and we knew we'd have to go back and pick them up because they'd been compromised. And so that was pretty exciting. I'd only been there a week, and it was, already. But we found subsequently that there had been only probably 1 or 2 of the opposition on the other side of the pad, and the shot that we heard went underneath the helicopter and hit one of the soldiers in his pack without hurting him. So then there was all sorts of things that used to happen. Gunships would roll in and demolish the trees around the area and all that sort of thing. And eventually we flew back, picked these guys up, and flew home again to lots of raucous laughter. But I thought, well, a week, and it's already starting to see.
It's already hairy.
It's already, yeah. And in fact, only a week after that, there was one of the patrols went, as they used to call them, went hot. They were being pursued by a larger Viet Cong force, and at night. And we used to have 2 aircraft on standby at night. So one of them went off to be to winch these guys out. I was in the 2nd aircraft, happily, and we acted as flare ship. They got some gunships up there.
You acted as a what?
Flare ship. We were over the top dropping flares to try and get some illumination on the area for the guys going in, so they weren't totally in the dark. And also for the gunships, which was we didn't have gunships on standby, so the procedure was more or less, well, who's had 1 beer? Okay, well, you're the flight leader, 2 beers. Okay, you're the second guy, 3 beers, where you can be co-pilot, and that sort of thing. So, and then during this whole thing, a USAF C-119, a transport converted to a gunship, turned up, and we became superfluous because this guy had flares to light up the entire country, and more ammunition, etc., etc. So we didn't have to do much, but it was a bit of a hairy operation. The done in the dark, and the guy that was captain of the aircraft, Bill Robinson, who I knew very well, he was awarded a decoration for it, which he richly deserved. And that was more or less the pattern. Things would be quiet. You'd be doing the occasional troop lift or logistic support or whatever, but particularly the SAS, the Special Forces inserts, exfils, they could be quite exciting. One in particular, I recall of that, where this was some months later, and I was captain of the aircraft, and roared in, dropped the guys off, took off, and we used to hold for about 20 minutes in case anything went bad, and they should come up on a beeper if anything went bad. Well, they didn't come up on the beeper. Someone had just held down the transmit switch, and you could hear automatic gunfire in the background. So we figured, okay, we're going to have to go back. And again, after there'd been lots of coordination and getting things right, and some gunships turned up, and I remember flying down quite vividly, the final approach into this pad, and seeing out of the corner of my eye on the left side being passed by a couple of rockets fired from gunships just out to the left, and watching them explode in the trees in the left, branches coming down, and the noise of our own door gunners were just shooting holes in the air, basically, but just making a lot of noise. And they used gunships came in and did some work, and I 50 years later, I still recall quite vividly flying down the final approach into this pad, and with this hole in the trees, and being overtaken by rockets down the left-hand side, and constant streams of minigun fire. The noise of our own door gunners, landed in the pad, out ran the Special Forces, and there was these gouts of earth being thrown up, walking towards the helicopter, and I thought briefly that, well, that's it. We're about to get shot up, and I realised it was one of the SAS guys running away, firing backwards over his shoulder and stitching up the earth about 5 feet behind him. So it was not well organised either, but it was intense. So that you do remember those sorts of incidents, and there were several of those. Lots of, I was 20. Most of us were between 20 and 23, I guess. It was at the time, I don't think you thought too much about it. That it was just, you go back that night and everyone would have a good laugh about it. But every now and then, things did come unstuck. I spent probably 3 months just doing dust off, and that could be hair raising. I had a very memorable event there because we're part of the big US dust off organisation, medevac organisation. We could be called out outside our province or outside our normal area of operation, and it was called out on one occasion after a US dust off had been shot up to go and pick up some US casualties in a province north of us, Long Khan province. And
May I ask a question?
hmm.
Did you know at the time that the American dust off had
Yeah.
been shot up?
Yes, we
So
did.
they told
yeah.
you. They told you that.
They
They
told
said,
us.
"Hey,
Yeah,
dust off
that's
has
right.
shot up.
Yeah.
Now you go in there."
Yeah, that's
what
right.
did you
You're told. Yeah. Well, the reason we're calling you guys out to go out of the province is our guy just got brassed up. Oh, okay, all right. Well, we did have. We were subtly different to the US dust offs in that we believed that the opposition didn't either understand or particularly respect the Red Cross. So we just maintained we didn't put a Red Cross on the side of it. We kept our door guns just in case. I don't think it made much difference really. But yeah, by the time we got there, it was starting to get dark, and it was the only way we were going to, these guys were going to get out in the next, till next morning, was if we did it. And we sat there we did two winches, very long winches, 200-foot winches, very high jungle. And all the time, I was busy because I was the captain. I was flying. The poor old co-pilot is sitting there reading the engine gauges, making sure everything's going okay. And Daryl Holden was the co-pilot at Moresby, and he's still to this day says he expected to die because he was trying to get his feet up underneath himself. And but it was immensely rewarding when we finally got 4 guys on board, got them away just as it was getting dark, and it's quite emotional even now. It was just hugely rewarding. No question about that. It was really great.
So you were lowering hooks down through the triple
lowering our winch
jungle and pulling guys off the jungle floor.
That's right. Yeah. I remember the first guy we were talking to on the radio was very panicky. Fortunately, someone took over from him on the radio. It was much easier to communicate with. But I could, they'd just, I believe they had been ambushed as a US platoon. They'd been ambushed by quite a large force and hit with rocket-propelled grenades, and so there were a lot of shrapnel injuries. And so that was one of several instances, but one of the very memorable ones. And even to the end, when you, my second last day on operations, the scheduler, when you're getting towards the end of your tour, he would try and put you on a pretty cushy number. And I was on what was called the 05 mission, which was to fly the task force commander. He was a brigadier, the 1-star, flying him around to his various units around the province to do a daily inspection, which I'm sure everyone out in the units really looked forward to, having the brigadier turn up. But anyway, so I did that. It was a cushy number. But that afternoon, a Australian platoon got into contact. The brigadier wanted to be flown out to the fire base, which was controlling the action. So I picked him up, and on the way past, we actually overflew the site of the contact, and I could hear one of my friends Ken Phillips, who was the dust-off pilot, trying to get out the Australian casualties. And there was a little bit of confusion, but anyway, we flew on, dropped off the Brigadier at the fire base, and I was returning to the task force at Nui Dat, once again overflying the contact. And as I did, I heard the co-pilot of the dust-off coming up saying that they'd been shot up and they had casualties. And so I followed them back to the fire base, landed 100 yards behind, about 100 yards behind them all the way, and landed beside them. And the crewman, the winch operator, Alan Bloxham, had been shot in the head. And we got him on board, flew him back to the field ambulance at Nui Dat, like the sort of the equivalent of MASH, and but he died. And to this day, I'm amazed at how quickly it turned off from the world's cushiest job to picking up one of your own who'd just been killed. A guy you knew very well, but you'd flown with, and all the rest of it. And so my last duties in Vietnam were actually doing the what they called Committee of Adjustment, which was to go through the casualties of personal effects in his uniforms and all that sort of stuff, and sort it out for either return to store or to return to his next of kin. So that was a sad ending to it. But
you had to do that for him, for your friend?
Yeah. There were some an officer had to be assigned to look after that formality, and so it's a very intrusive thing. You go back to his quarters and go through and make sure that there's things that wouldn't be offensive to his relatives, for example, or it wasn't a security thing. It was just he was engaged to be married, so you don't want to send anything that might add further to the stress of his fiancée or his parents. But then other stuff like some of his flying kit and that sort of thing would just go back to store, so he just arranged for that, as they didn't want that back, obviously. But that was a bummer of a way to finish the tour.
So before we get to your I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, that's okay. Yeah.
So before we get to your return home at the end of your tour, can I just ask you a couple more questions about your experience in Vietnam?
Yeah, sure.
So while you were in Vietnam, how often did you hear from folks back home?
Pretty frequently. I'd married just before I left, and so mail was delivered fairly frequently, like every couple of days. So, snail mail, as we'd have it these days. Telephone communications, if you wanted to phone home, you had to book that sort of days in advance and go to a specific place, and so that was out of the question. So it was all snail mail, but yeah, every couple of days. It wasn't too bad.
Did you get letters from your wife?
Yeah, from my wife or my parents. There was a special sort of envelopes and that sort of thing, which would be sent to I think more or less the same as the US, where it goes to an APO and it'd be forwarded on. And every now and then there'd be an Australian C-130, probably about weekly, would come up from Australia through Malaysia, and my wife was resourceful enough to go out and get some snacks and things, carton, and get that on the Herc. And so every few weeks there'd be not only myself but other people would get snacks from home, cakes, that sort of thing. it was much more isolated, much more isolated than it is these days, but not too bad compared with, because we were always comparing ourselves with guys who had worked in World War II in Korea. Indeed, we had a couple of people in our squadron who had flown in Korea, and even our equipment officer, bizarrely enough, had been a Luftwaffe crew member in World War II. So it was a bit of a diverse group. And we, yeah.
Did you hear anything while you were there? Did you hear from either news reports or newspapers or letters from home, any indication of how the Australian public felt about the role in Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, look, it by 1970, there was starting to be vocal opposition to it, and we knew that, and we would hear about that, and we were very aware of it. In fact, sadly, some of our a couple of the wives were adversely affected simply by people being very, not abusive, but very negative towards them, which, I mean, none of their business. I mean, we're just doing our job. But it didn't impact us on a day-to-day basis. We were aware that there was significant opposition, and even amongst ourselves, there were, a couple of my good friends were, could see that this was a bit of a crock. The whole war was not well organised and probably not well thought out from day one. But when you are being paid by the government and the government says, we're having a war here, you don't get to pick your war. So we just did our job, and I think that would be almost universal, not only from my friend's point of view, but from the army as well, from what I know. We were very fortunate in that we didn't suffer any repercussions when we came home, because we remained in the military with the same people we know all along. But guys who were discharged as soon as they got home, a lot of those suffered some, army people. Some of them found it very hard. People were. Yeah, I'd like to think that these days, even though there were people opposed to recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they didn't take it out on the troops. They aimed at where it should have been aimed, as the government. So, yeah. So I didn't suffer any ill effects of that, but we were well aware of that. And of course, the war was winding down. Units were pulling out. In fact, bizarrely enough, at one stage, our living quarters used to be within a larger US Army base, and then the US Army contracted their base, and we wound up this little island of Australia, just out in suburban Vung Tau. Nothing happened as a result, I'm happy to say, but in fact, the most exciting thing
they just shrunk the perimeter, and so
they just shrunk the perimeter. So when we got in our vehicles to drive down to fly the aircraft, we had to go through a US Army checkpoint to get down to the aerodrome. So that was a little bit of a bone of contention, but yeah, as it happened, it didn't adversely affect us. There had been, just before that happened, there had been a firefight just across the road from the entrance to our living quarters, but that was they believed some Koreans trying to break into a US supply area to steal whatever wasn't nailed down, and our airfield defence guards were waiting, and when they said something like "halt, who goes there?" these guys opened with an M60 and a grenade launcher. So we're all the movie ground to a halt, the bar closed, and was a firefight across the road. But yeah, the smart thing to do was at that stage, we figured was go to bed, because there was so many people who'd had a few drinks who are now getting around with submachine guns and pistols to defend themselves. The best chance was getting shot by one of your own.
So did you have fairly regular or frequent contact with American soldiers and pilots, or Korean or other allied forces?
Yeah, mainly US guys. As I said, on the base, same as we were, there were USAF forward air controllers flying O2s, Oscar Deuces, and USAF transport pilots. And there was also a maintenance facility there, which was did a lot of work on Huey Cobra gunships, and we'd often come across them. They'd actually often come up to our Riam and point at Nui Dat to load up with ammunition or whatever. Bizarrely enough, it was a Huey Cobra training team. They were, and during Lamson 719, the big incursion into Laos by the Vietnamese, supported by US helicopters, etc. In early 71, they got sent up there, and they came back. Well, a couple of them were lost actually up there, but they came back saying just what a nightmare it was for helicopter crews in particular, in that we'd been used to being quite safe flying along 2,000 feet above ground level, but up there was serious anti-aircraft fire. 6,000 feet, people getting shot down, and if gunships were trying to attack a 50 caliber position, then there'd be other 3 or 4 50 caliber anti-aircraft positions would be shooting at you at the same time. So yeah, that was when it became fairly obvious that whatever happened in future, all our tactics were now out the window within a couple of years, and we'd have to change the whole scenario of helicopter tactics. But that was beyond my scope of my operation. I went back and flew helicopters in Australia for a couple of years before moving on back to fixed wing. And that couple of years was an anticlimax. It was probably the most dangerous time in my flying career, because I had been there, done that, overconfident, and fortunately nothing really serious happened to me, but a couple of my colleagues had accidents, largely through overconfidence. Fortunately not fatal, but we were young and silly, and when you're 20, at the time I got home I was 22, and you come back to Australia and they try and tell you to do it. Well, you got to do these other rules. Well, that's not what we were doing, back in the war. Then the wheels come off occasionally.
I just can't imagine being 22 years old and being a combat veteran.
Well, there's a lot of them. The only way you fight wars, of course, is with young people, young men largely, but these days young men as well. So you've got to be young, because you are infused with that feeling that it can't happen to you. It will happen to someone else. I have gained amazing respect for some of my peers who were senior officers who were much older, like our CO, who had flown in combat in Korea. He was now in his mid-30s. He had a couple of kids at home, and he was doing the same sort of stuff as we were doing. And I thought, you'd have a different attitude. And in fact, very sadly, not long after I left, we had a guy called Lofty Lance, one of our pilots, who was killed. And Lofty was early 40s, had a teenage son, a couple of other kids. And I thought, what the hell were you doing here, Lofty? You know, it's yeah, it's a young person's thing, because you don't have the same responsibilities. Even though I was married, I didn't have any kids. So yeah, fortunately, you don't think about these things too much at the time. And for us in the flying world, you'd have, you know, literally a few minutes of things being really horrendous, and then return to calm. Whereas again, I have great sympathy for infantrymen who were slogging through the jungle, waiting to step on a mine, and be out there for days at a time, when the drop of a hat, it could all go bad. Great sympathy and respect for them. Where we're in very dangerous situations for brief periods of time, then flew off back to the bar that night and let our hair down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's any small thing. You know, those guys were in very dangerous situations, you know, very suddenly, and maybe for protracted periods. But
oh yeah,
they could focus on fighting. You had to focus on fighting and keeping a helicopter
going. Yeah, and again, as I mentioned, way back in that dust off story, if I was the pilot flying, then I was busy just sitting there in the hover for 20 minutes. Whereas the guy in the other seat he's got relatively little to do other than worry about what could go wrong. But you know, the day after, it could be me. We'd swap seats. So yeah,
right.
So yeah.
This episode is going to air. We're going to publish it just a few days before Australia's Vietnam Veterans Day.
Yeah, long 10 days.
I just wonder, in the 5 decades that have passed since you were there, what has been your experience with Vietnam Veterans Day in Australia, and what, if anything, are you planning to do to observe it this year?
Okay, well, I don't do a lot of Vietnam Veterans Day, but our squadron marches in Anzac Day, which is 25th of, you know, it's the big, I think 25th of April. So we all get, well, a decreasing number of us get together at that. But this year in particular, there's a next Friday, there is a fairly large ceremony to be held in Canberra for the 50th anniversary of the end of our operations in Vietnam. Now, we were a very small part of it, 9 Squadron. We're 16 helicopters and their crews and their maintainers, compared with all the infantry and so on. But as an indication of how important that is, there'll be at least 80 people from our little outfit, including some wives and some people whose husbands or fathers were killed, will be there just from our little outfit. So that is going to be huge this year. There's a national television broadcast of it, and unfortunately, it's being held in Canberra in the middle of winter, so it's damn cold. But nonetheless, so when we do get together, it's not so much remembrance of Vietnam, not when we do remember people who passed away, but more regularly people who passed away more recently, sadly. And it's all about friendship and camaraderie. The same people who we met 50 years ago when we arrived on the squadron, some of them will be there. And sadly, just in the last month, we've lost 2 of our pilots, old age and cancer, but that's the way it is at this stage. But the commemoration is not about Vietnam so much as as about the people you served with, and catching up and having a damn good time. And I'm sure after a couple of drinks, we'll be much better pilots these days than we ever were at the time. It's in fact, we're actually going to have for this event, there will be a Huey and a Caribou Transport will do an overflight. I suspect quite low over the crowd, and there won't be dry eye in the house. So the co-pilot of the Huey will be one of ours, Mick Haxel, who was much the same as me. He was about 23 when he went up there, before I went up there, and Hax was awarded a decoration for an action he took part in. Flew helicopters for the rest of his life. Now in his 80s, but bigger and better than ever. So yeah, it'll be a big one.
Yeah. Do you mind, just so that I have it on the recording, and then so that I make sure that I get it right, would you please tell me the formal name of your squadron?
Okay, it's number 9 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force. Okay,
that's a lot shorter than I expected. Like our unit names tend to be pretty long.
No, just 9 Squadron RAAF. Our call sign was Albatross, which sounds a bit weird. But
it does. I was going to say it's an interesting choice.
It goes, and I mean, you know, when you're flying around Albatross 01, Albatross 04, or whatever you were, but it goes back to when the squadron was originally formed in the 1930s. It was a seaplane squadron flying off naval ships doing scouting. So it was looking for, and bizarrely enough, it has, because the Army have taken over all the helicopters these days, and the squadron was disbanded back in the 80s, late 80s. But it's just been reformed, and it's going to be flying RPVs, long-range RPVs out over the ocean, doing basically what it was doing in the 1930s, but with much more precision and so on. So that's why we were albatrosses. We were.
What was your nickname?
Chook. I'm Chook. Yeah, Chook, as in a chicken. CHOOK. CHOOK.
That's a slang term for chicken.
Yeah, it's slang term for a fowl, for chicken. So we had other guys were named the Crowd because he was so big that the room was instantly crowded. Another guy was Top Pig. Another one was Woofy. And it's amazing how they stick. Early 90s, I was in a jumbo going to London, and I was doing the radio work. We were somewhere over Tajikistan or somewhere or other, some stand somewhere. And unbeknownst to me, there's another Qantas aircraft heading south as we're heading north. And I made this call, and out of the ether comes a voice, "G'day, Chook." And I recognised him immediately. He said, "G'day, Bats." The other guy, Eric Baddams, who's Bats. And I've often thought, this Russians down below thinking, what are Chooks and Bats doing up here? In what's the story? What's the code?
So why did you have that nickname? Was there?
I have no idea, but there was one guy, one of the instructors, a guy called John Burns, whose nickname was Dumpy for probably obvious reasons, and Dumpy decided everyone had to have a nickname, and for reasons known only to Dumpy, I became Chook.